Hello and welcome to Stories of Resilience, our podcast series to promote an ACE-aware nation in Scotland. Adverse childhood experiences touch us all in one way or another. This series explores the thoughts of those involved with the ACEs movement in Scotland, and we talk to individuals who have stories of resilience to share. I'm Gary Robinson. My guest today is David Cameron. That is the real David Cameron. David is a presenter, trainer, mentor, coach and advisor and works in education at home and abroad. We'll hear from David in just a second, but first to quote him, "I want to make a difference and believe that I can. The difference I want to make is ensuring that all young people have an education that brings richness to their lives." David, thank you for joining me on Stories of Resilience. We'll see you at the conference, of course, in September, but it's good to have a bit of a pre-conference blether, if you like, and just to gather some initial thoughts from you. For those people who aren't aware of your work, David, I'm sure there's not an awful lot out there. Could you just give us an overview of what you do in the country?
I come from an education background. I was a teacher for a long time. I was then eventually a head of education and then director of children's services. Since then, I've been working independently. I work right across the UK. I've worked abroad. I do a lot of work around creativity. I do a lot of work around teaching and learning, leadership. I work directly in schools. I work at conferences. I do a lot of speaking, as anyone who knows me will vouch. And I fundamentally try and get people to be aware of the demand for social justice, of the need to recognise children's potential much more than we currently do, to find ways of doing that much more ambitiously and accurately, and to try and fundamentally make a difference in the lives of young people and ultimately in our society more widely.
And how long have you been doing that for now, David? Once you got out of the teaching and head of education, in terms of the work that you currently do, how long has that been going on for?
I'm going to question the got out of. I was more got out of in that sense than got out. I had no desire to move from the kind of work that I was doing. It wasn't an ambition that took me where I am, but I've been doing that now for 8 years, and remarkably, I found it both enjoyable and rewarding, and I think I might have had a wee bit of impact along the way.
You might be being a little modest there, but we'll find out more as the conversation goes on. David, when did you first become aware of ACEs? Was it a number of years ago? Have you been ever since the report came out? Was it 97? Or is this a relatively new movement that you're involved in? So what's your history with ACEs?
I've been aware of ACEs probably since I was 8. I grew up in a family. I grew up in a community. I grew up from an early age aware that young people had different backgrounds, different difficulties. I was aware as a child of the impact that the experiences that other children had, and indeed my own experiences had in my own life and the way that I saw the world. I've been very aware that the lives of people that I know, some of them close to me, have been damaged by the experiences that they had as a child. So I've been aware that the impact of what happens to children and their circumstances, that the impact that has on their lives in a long-term sense is something that I've recognised from the time that I was a child. What's happened, I think, with the research is that that's validated and vindicated the views that I had. But I honestly think that it would take somebody of incredible density not to recognise that the futures that young people have are determined by what happens to them during their childhood, unless there are interventions, unless there are moves made to change that experience. And fundamentally, for me, that's the role that the research has played.
And in terms of your experience from the age of 8 and onwards then into your professional career, is that something that you've always been mindful of when you've been teaching and developing young people?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think I've always been aware that there is not a level playing field, to lapse into cliche at this stage. And I think there are things that one instinctively understood as a professional. If one had empathy, if one had identity, if one had an interest in people, then that realization was always there, and one always tried to respond to it in whatever role you had at that point.
Some of the leading thinkers around ACEs, as I've been gathering and chatting to them, have very robust views and some uncomfortable truths, I think, sometimes when we talk about how we bring children up in Scotland, from Carol Craig in her writings. John Carnochan has been very vocal. Do you share that view? Do we bring our children up harshly in this country?
I hate generalizations, and I hate stereotyping, and I don't think either of these serves us well in terms of our thinking. I think there is as much truth in Docherty as a novel as there is in Sunset Song. I think there is as much in Scotland's ambition reflected as I'll do this at the conference, reflected in Hamish Henderson's "Come all ye acquaint with freedom. Never heed what the hoodies croak for doom. In your house all the sons of Adam will find breed barley brie in painted room." And I think that strand is there in Scotland, in Scottish culture and in Scottish life. I think there's a communitarianism in Scotland which is stronger than in many, many parts of England. I think there is a sense of mutual responsibility. I love the fact that so many people in Scotland continue to identify with their background rather than their current circumstances. I love the debate that there is in Scotland around the idea of social mobility. I know that there is harshness. There's been harshness in the environment. One only needs to look at something like His Bloody Project to get a sense of that deep and dark Calvinism that's rooted in Scottish culture ideology and in a history of poverty. But I think there are many, many, many examples of Scotland triumphing over that, and Scottish people individually triumphing over that. So I would be less ready to rush to the generalisation than perhaps others.
And a question that I've asked the majority of our guests, David, is why do you think now we've got this almost universal language about ACEs? So we can describe it in the media, people get it. Lots of people talk about having a light bulb moment. Why do you think now, after, I don't know, what was it, so 11 years, 12 years, we talked to John Carnochan about the work done in 2005 with the Violence Reduction Unit and so on. Why now do you think we've got it, and now we have it? Indeed, if we do, where do we go with ACEs? I find that an incredibly interesting question. I think what's happened more recently is that there has been much more of a grassroots movement around the recognition of adverse childhood experiences and its impact. I think what's happened is that people like Suzanne Zeedyk, like Tina Henry, Pauline Scott, and others have bypassed the establishment, they've bypassed the conventional mechanisms, and they've gone directly to people. I think the tour with the film Resilience has been a wonderful example of that. It's been kind of like the psychological version of 784 touring the Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil in the 70s. That they went beyond theatres and went into communities, and they had an impact as a result of that. And I think there's an element of that. And what we've got, I think, currently is we've got a grassroots movement, which again, I think the conference is absolutely rooted in. And it's an informed grassroots movement.
the vocabulary of ACEs, whether the term was used or not, the vocabulary of ACEs was widespread in the professional debate during the development of getting it right for every child in Scotland. It was impossible virtually at one stage to go to a conference without encountering a chief medical officer or somebody talking about the long-term impact of adverse childhood experiences. And there was no doubt that that professional debate was rich. And I guess that's the time that John Carnochan would be talking about in terms of, the early rise of this thinking and this awareness. But I think we've, to some extent at least, captured the public imagination. And I think one of the things which has happened very clearly and very directly is that grassroots movement has fundamentally drawn in people who have a professional role associated with children and can translate the vocabulary of science into the reality of their own experience. And I think that's given the movement a vibrancy and vivacity, which in turn has put pressure on politicians who, again, have responded emotionally, I think. I think one of the things we're seeing in terms of the reaction, particularly from senior Scottish politicians, is partly an emotional one, driven by that recognition that so many young people in this country are affected by an invisible disability, that their lives are dominated by who they've been rather than who they might be. And I think that ties into a general ambition that we have to make Scotland not just the best country in the world to grow up in, and I'm not overly keen on that hubris either, but to make Scotland a successful and admirable nation, which has the right kind of priorities in terms of equality, social justice, but also, I think, a country of economic ambition, which aims for a situation where as many people as possible can have a lifestyle which is comfortable and where relative poverty is minimised, if not eradicated.
Let's stay with the politicians. You talked about them having an emotional response. What can they do on a practical level?
Well, I think there's a huge number of things that they can do on a practical level. One is to keep doing stuff. I become incredibly frustrated. I think getting it right for every child was probably the right kind of initiative. I think it's being reviewed, and I think it's right that we review it and look to see what might be learned from that. Because people, for all the groundswell that there is, people don't want another initiative, and we certainly don't want ACEs to become another label, another initiative. We don't want to get into that cycle, I think, with it. So what we have is we have a belief that was well established not just through GIRFEC but through new community schools. We have schools that have been now built. Perthshire is a really good example, with campuses involving health services, all of that embrace of the wider community. And lots of these initiatives are the key. We need to move forward with them with greater coherence. We need to be less lured into the byways of bureaucracy around them. And we need to maintain a clear focus on the purpose of these initiatives in terms of having a broader impact in children's lives. And we need to be more aware that when we say that everybody wants the best for their children, the reality is that in many instances, each of us wants the best for our children. And we need to recognise that there is self-interest, both personal and professional. We need to recognise that people are willing to talk about the kind of initiatives that will make change and less ready to pay the tax levels that will subsidise these and make them possible. And we need to recognise these conflicts and dilemmas and actually begin to confront them so that we finish things. GIRFEC now, I would argue, has become more of a slogan than a policy. And I hope that the review of that will change that situation. I also think that there are small things, very small things that we can do. I think we can simplify the demands that we place on our schools. And I will talk endlessly to you, Gary, about ways and techniques that we can use to achieve that. I think that we can clarify purposes. I think we can do a lot in terms of simple, straightforward actions, both at national level, and fundamentally give people the kind of support and the kind of permissions that will allow them to make the change that they clearly are preparing to make at their own hand.
So let me see if I've got this right from what you're saying, David. So stick with getting it right for every child.
Yeah.
Turn it more into a policy as it started, but review it and improve it is what you would suggest to the government.
Yeah, well, that would be one of the major things, I think. I think the idea of trying to visit something as a new initiative, and I think that cycle that we're into of politicians needing to own any development in order that they can claim credit for it is a cycle that's been fundamentally damaging to consistency and coherence in public policy. I suspect that Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland progressed better when there was widespread political consensus around it, rather than the stage that we're currently at, where it's become something of a political football.
It'd be interesting because we've interviewed John Swinney, and I won't give too much away on that, but you'll be able to hear the John's view on that, the Deputy First Minister's view on that within that podcast. If we go to the conference once again, without giving too much away, David, what can the 1,700 people plus so far expect to hear from you on the day?
They can expect to hear Blue Rose Code. They can expect to hear Sting. They can expect to hear the Monkees. They can expect to hear Karen Polwart. And that'll all be crammed into 20 minutes. The key messages will be that I think we have the tools. I think we have the commitment. And what we need to do is to build a movement. The title of my session is "And We'll Dance." From Sting's song, They Dance Alone. And that's designed to remind people that from the tragedy of Pinochet's Chile, where people died and were disappeared, where the challenges faced were enormous, there was change. And women were able to dance on stage at a massive performance in Santiago. Before a public who rose to their feet and applauded them. We can have that kind of change if the will is there to make it. And I want to remind people that if we have that belief in possibility, that if we learn from some of the grassroots movements that there are in Scotland, and I'll be talking about a number of them, we have models which allow us to see how change can be made. And we have fantastic success stories. The Violence Reduction Unit, which you're well familiar with, is an incredible story. And people need to be stopping and saying, what does that success mean for us in schools? What does it mean for us in social work? What does it mean for us in terms of public attitude and culture? And I'll be reminding people that we are moving forward in Scotland, not from a basis of failure, but from a basis of success. And I'll be reminding people that there are more than tears in the Clyde. That we are the country which, in McIlvanney's terms, and I'll be quoting McIlvanney on the day, in the face of incredibly difficult circumstances and uncertainty, consistently try to dream ourselves a beach. And giving people that sense of their own power and their own possibility to make the changes that we need to make this a nation that we can be more proud of.
And when people leave the conference on the 26th, what do they need to do to keep this movement going?
I think what they need to do fundamentally is to continue to focus first on what they can do at their own hand. I think that what we're trying to build, I've used the term and it's been taken up much more widely, what we're trying to build is a culture of kindness. where people are much more likely to encounter that level of support and understanding and empathy, whoever they're dealing with. So I think the 1,700 people can go away and do what they can in their own right, and I think they can make the effort to be leaders in their own environment, to stand up and proudly say, this is what we do and this is how we do it. I think they can look for movements that they can ally with. There's a fantastic book out just now by a guy called Paul Dix called When the Adults Change, Everything Changes. It's flying off the shelves. I think people can read that, get others to read it. I think people can make these moves as individuals, and I think they can make them as leaders within their own workplaces. And I think that what we can do, the 1,700 people particularly at that conference, is that they can make sure that the government has to listen. And I think you'll know from your conversation with John Swinney that he is a man who certainly, to me, appears to be very willing to listen. You know, I have absolutely no doubt of his good intent. I think there are things that I might advise him to do differently from the way that he's currently doing them. I think I might wish to change some of the vocabulary around public pronouncements. But I think we need to seek to work with that intent, which is clearly there, and take advantage of that, and edge and push and harry in order that the reality of action matches the ambition for change.
David Cameron, indeed, the real David Cameron, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That was Stories of Resilience.